It was 10:42 a.m. when my phone buzzed. One vibration, no message preview, just the silent nudge of a meeting I didn't request. Executive boardroom, 11:08 a.m. That was all it said. No context, no sender, just the kind of summons that doesn't invite questions, only compliance. I stared at the screen for a few seconds longer than I should have. Long enough to feel the rhythm of the second hand on the wall clock. Long enough to feel the air shift in my lungs. I knew, the way women know, men. The way we read silence, glances, the way coffee is poured, but not offered. Something was ending. Still, I stood, straightened the sleeves of the blazer I kept for emergencies, fixed the pearl button that always came undone, slipped on the shoes I only wore when I needed to appear composed, not comfortable. The elevator ride to the executive floor was too short, or maybe too long. It's strange how time distorts when you're walking into a moment you'll remember forever. I didn't press a button. My ID badge knew the way. The mirrored walls didn't flatter. They reflected back a woman who already knew what was coming, but chose to walk in anyway. The receptionist didn't look up when I stepped out. That told me everything. She always greeted me, called me Ms. Rowen, never Margaret, even after 29 years. But that morning, she was stone. The boardroom door was already ajar. They wanted me to push it open. They wanted me to walk into my own ending. And I did. Quietly. No knock. Just a measured breath as I stepped inside. 3 people sat at the table. None of them met my eyes. There was an extra chair, deliberately off-center. Not across. Not beside. It was positioned like an afterthought, a chair for someone about to be erased. Margaret, thank you for coming on such short notice. One of them began. It was Julian, the same man I had mentored when he was still a junior analyst, shaking in budget reviews. Now he was using the tone HR departments train for neutral, gentle, surgical. We're undergoing a structural realignment, he said. That's corporate for, we've decided you're disposable. They laid it out, phrases rehearsed and sanded down for plausible deniability. Something about performance metrics. Something about redundancy. But none of it was true. Not with my record. Not with what I knew. The severance papers were already printed. They slid them across like a menu. No space for questions, just signatures, a check. 2. They thought money could soften erasure. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I let the silence sit, let it grow teeth. Then I did the one thing they didn't expect. I stood up, collected the envelope, and said, "You'll be hearing from me." No threat, no drama, just truth. I walked out slower than I walked in. By the time I reached the parking lot, the drizzle had started, cold enough to bite, not enough to soak. I didn't open the umbrella. Let it sting. Let it remind me I was still alive. Back home. I peeled off the wet blazer, poured a glass of water I didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table. I didn't need time to process. Processing was for people caught off guard. I wasn't, not really. There's a kind of betrayal that happens slowly. In slights. In meetings you're no longer invited to. In ideas repeated louder by someone else. It doesn't scream, it corrodes. And I had felt it for years. I got up, walked down the hallway to the guest room no one stayed in, pulled down the ladder to the attic and climbed into dust and silence. In the far corner, beneath a moth-eaten blanket and a suitcase filled with grief, sat a box. Gray metal, no markings, just a 3-digit lock I hadn't touched since the year my husband died. 6/2/4, our anniversary. It clicked open. Inside records, copies, names, slips of conversation now, notes from meetings they thought were off the record. A USB drive labeled in my husband's handwriting, "Use only when the cost of silence is higher." I never wanted to open that box. I hoped I never would. But betrayal is funny. It doesn't just break trust. It rearranges your spine. It reminds you that silence can either be survival or surrender. And I wasn't in the mood to surrender. I placed the box on the dining table, next to the untouched water, and turned on the overhead light even though it was barely noon. Shadows stretched across the walls like whispers I hadn't yet spoken. I sifted through the contents slowly, not because I was hesitant, but because I needed to remember every step that brought me here. Every slight, every theft of credit, every whisper of "she's past her prime" uttered just loud enough to seed doubt in the minds of men who'd once respected me. There were spreadsheets with discrepancies too precise to be accidental, memos that contradicted public filings, emails forwarded to my personal account in moments of quiet dread. But it wasn't just the documents. It was the annotations. The footnotes in my husband's handwriting. He saw what I didn't, long before I was ready to see it. His voice was in those margins, guiding, steady, loving. The last time we'd spoken about the company, it was late, and I was working through budget revisions at the kitchen counter. He poured me coffee, watched me sigh, said, "They'll take more if you don't draw a line." I had laughed it off, told him it wasn't that kind of place, that I was respected, valued. He didn't argue, just kissed my temple and went upstairs. 2 weeks later, he was gone. Grief has a way of dulling every other betrayal, until the day it sharpens them. That day had come. I took out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. Most names were irrelevant now, colleagues who turned quiet, assistants who stopped replying, juniors too afraid to be seen aligned with me. But there was one name I never deleted: Gabriel Tran. Gabe had been my boss's boss once, a man who valued silence because he knew its weight. He left the company years ago, moved into federal service. Fraud investigation, I think. We hadn't spoken since his retirement send-off, but I remembered the way he shook my hand. Firm, 2 seconds longer than most. And he whispered, "You're smarter than any of them. Don't let them gaslight you into forgetting that." I pressed the call button. It rang once, twice. Then his voice, older but unmistakable, answered Margaret. I didn't ask how he knew it was me. "I think I have something you'll want to see," I said. A pause. Then, "Are you safe?" "Yes." "Good. Tell me everything." Slowly, for the next 20 minutes. I laid out the evidence. Not just the fraud, the culture, the patterns, the timing of my dismissal. He asked few questions. Took notes, I assumed. Then he gave me an address. "Bring everything, Monday morning, early. I'll have a team." I didn't ask what kind. I didn't need to. After we hung up, I sat in stillness, the kind that only comes after the decision has been made. I wasn't afraid. I was resolved. The weekend passed like breath through cracked glass. I didn't speak to anyone. Not my daughter. Not the neighbors. I didn't answer texts from concerned former colleagues who just heard. I didn't open the door when the CEO's assistant drove by and pretended it was a coincidence. I cleaned. Not just the house. Myself. I ironed my softest blouse, the one my husband bought for my 50th birthday. I polished the shoes I wore the day I received the company's highest honor. I chose earrings that didn't sparkle, only gleamed. I packed the box into a simple black case. No logo, no statement. Monday morning came quietly. I left the house before sunrise. The streets were still empty, except for the mail trucks and mothers with early shifts. I drove without music, without noise, just the rhythm of turn signals and breath. The federal building was austere. No brass, no glass, just stone and certainty. Security checked my ID. My appointment had been flagged. They escorted me through without questions. Gabe met me in a private room. No windows, 2 chairs, 1 table. I opened the case, took out the box, and I began. For 3 hours, I spoke with precision, not emotion. Emotion could be dismissed. Precision couldn't. Each document was dated, sourced, explained. Each email was contextualized. I connected dots they hadn't seen but now couldn't ignore. At one point, Gabe leaned back and let out a breath so slow I barely noticed it. "This is systemic," he murmured. I nodded, and deliberate. He didn't argue. When it was over, they thanked me, not with words, but with the silence that follows recognition. One agent stood and said, "We'll handle it from here." I walked out without needing to look back, because I knew something had shifted, and it wasn't just policy, it was power. I got home before noon, but the air already felt heavier, not with dread, with anticipation, like the sky before a storm still, electric, waiting. I poured myself a glass of tea I didn't want and sat at the kitchen window. From there, I could see the street, the mailbox, the edge of the neighbor's roses. The world looked unchanged. That's always the strangest part, how normal things appear when something irreversible has begun. The first call came just after 1. It was a blocked number. I didn't answer. Let it ring out, then watched as a voicemail appeared. I didn't listen. 5 minutes later, another, then a message from someone I hadn't heard from in years, a man I once trained who now sat on the board. He asked if we could talk, said it was urgent but friendly. I deleted it without reading the rest. By nightfall, I had 22 missed calls, 13 voicemails, and 6 emails each from a name that had once been warm, then turned cold, and now sounded like desperation. They weren't reaching out because they cared. They were reaching out because they knew, or feared, or both. The last message of the night came from Julian, my former protege, the one who slid the severance check across the boardroom table without flinching. His voice trembled in the audio, said he felt terrible, said he didn't know, said he'd like to explain. I didn't respond. I turned off the phone. There's a power in silence. Most people think noise wins, but noise is reactive. Silence is surgical. It forces others to fill the space with their guilt, their anxiety, their unraveling. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Tuesday began without ceremony. I brewed coffee, read a few pages from a novel I'd never had time to finish, and watered the succulents on the porch. The sunlight hit just right, warm without apology. Around 11, I saw a car slow in front of the house. Dark sedan, government plates. He didn't stop, just rolled past, enough for me to know the wheels were in motion. At noon, someone knocked on the door. It wasn't loud, just deliberate. I opened it. Julian stood there, tie crooked, eyes sunken, hands clenching and unclenching like he'd practiced an apology and forgot the lines. "Margaret, I didn't know where else to." I raised a hand, not to silence him, just to stop time. "I won't be discussing anything on this porch," I said, voice steady. "If you have something to say, speak to my attorney." He blinked, his mouth opened, then closed again, like a fish pulled from safe water. "Please," he whispered. "They're going to pin it on me." I said nothing. He stood there for several more seconds, long enough to realize I meant it. Then he walked away, slower than he came. That night, another envelope arrived. No return address, just slid under my door. Inside was a statement unsigned, confirming the misuse of funds, falsified projections, insider trading. It was a confession dressed as a warning, or maybe a plea. I scanned it, filed it. Then I wrote one line on a blank piece of paper and sealed it in an envelope of my own. The next morning, I had it delivered, not to Julian, not to the board, to the media. Because silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's the space before thunder. And I had waited long enough. By Thursday, headlines were everywhere. Whistleblower exposes decades-long corporate fraud. Former executive fired days before pension speaks through evidence, not words. They didn't use my name, not yet, but they would. By Friday, the calls stopped being polite, legal, urgent. Some came from private firms, some from former colleagues now pretending to be journalists. But I said nothing. Let them spiral. Let them wonder. I didn't need to yell. I had already spoken through proof, through timing, through the calm refusal to play their game. And in that silence, I was louder than I had ever been. By Saturday morning, they began showing up in person. First was the HR director, the same one who avoided eye contact in the boardroom just days before. He didn't ring the doorbell, just parked across the street, got out, and stood there like he expected I'd invite him in for coffee and second chances. I didn't move. I watched from the kitchen, a safe distance between us, as he paced back and forth, phone in hand, but never calling. After 20 minutes, he gave up, drove off without looking back. Then came the board member's wife, a woman I had once lunched with at a corporate retreat, who complimented my brooch and asked for parenting advice she'd never follow. She carried a gift bag. I didn't open the door. Gifts given in panic always come with strings. By noon, I had a folder of letters slid through the mail slot, each more apologetic than the last. This wasn't personal. One said, "We were misinformed. There's still time to fix this." One even dared to write, "You're the only one who can save us now." I burned that one. Not out of rage, out of finality. There's a point at which an apology isn't repentance, it's strategy. A bid to reclaim narrative, to dilute consequence with forced sentiment. I had no room for that anymore. But it was the letter from the CEO that nearly made me laugh. He didn't type it. He wrote it by hand, on company letterhead, as if branding could soften betrayal. He spoke of regret, of misunderstanding, of how he'd been fed a distorted version of events. Said he trusted the wrong people, that he never wanted it to end this way. And then he asked no, begged for a private meeting. He offered to make it right, offered a position with full benefits reinstated, plus back pay. Even offered an apology in the press if I'd let this die quietly. Let this die quietly. As if silence was the currency he could buy back. I placed the letter in my fireplace and watched the flames curl its edges. There are moments in life when you stop negotiating with the past. When you stop asking why and start answering how. How you will be remembered. How you will define the truth. Not in speeches, but in steps. That evening, I made my final delivery. One envelope, thick, handwritten index tabs, the original whistleblower report, signed, supplementary documentation, chain of command signatures showing who knew and when, dates, amounts, timestamps, all copied and sealed with a notarized statement from a third party. Destination the State Attorney General's office. I dropped it off myself. No courier, no assistant. The woman at the desk asked if I wanted a receipt. No, I said. They'll know it's me. And they did. The next morning, the storm arrived. Not thunder, not rain, subpoenas. The board was blindsided. Meetings were canceled. Press statements were issued and retracted within hours. Their publicist posted a bland placeholder about ongoing internal reviews. But it was too late. Someone leaked the internal emails, not me. That's the best part about truth. Once it's set free, it doesn't need your permission to move. The company's stock dropped 18% by noon. Not catastrophic, but the first fracture in a very expensive mask. I spent the day organizing the attic, cleaning out the last box of my husband's files. Not because I needed the space, but because closure sometimes looks like clearing dust from the corners of your past. In the late afternoon, my daughter called. I hadn't told her the full extent, only that something at work had shifted. But now, the headlines were everywhere. She was furious. Why didn't you tell me they did this to you because I didn't need sympathy? I said, I needed silence to work. She didn't understand, not at first. She wanted drama, wanted public shaming, wanted me to go on camera and tear them apart. But that's not how women like me fight. We don't scream in rooms where they expect us to cry. We document, we endure. And when the time is right, we remove the floorboards under their feet, one quiet nail at a time. By Sunday night, 3 board members had resigned. Julian's name was now in the press. The internal council had issued a statement distancing themselves from executive decisions. And I watered my plants. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is everything they said she couldn't, while making it look like she never lifted a finger. Monday arrived with no alarm clock, no meeting calendar, and no reason to rush, except one. The envelope I had prepared the night before was waiting by the door. Not for the Attorney General, not for the press. This one was personal. It was addressed to Julian's wife. Not out of spite, not revenge, out of necessity. Because there are always people left in the wake. Collateral they never calculate. And she deserved to know the truth about who she married. The envelope contained no accusations, no dramatic language, just timelines, credit transfers, a copy of the internal audit I wasn't supposed to see, a printout of the email thread where her husband approved a shell contract in her name without her knowledge, a quiet betrayal, tucked between numbers and paper trails. I dropped it in the mail myself. No signature required. Then I drove to the lake. It was where my husband and I used to go when we needed to think, or breathe, or just remember that not everything valuable lived on a spreadsheet. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that doesn't promise rain, only reflection. I sat by the edge with a thermos of black coffee and the last thing he ever wrote to me, a card, just 6 words, pride is earned. Keep your silence. At the time, I thought he meant humility. Now, I understood he meant strength. While I was gone, the company called twice, once from a private number, once from legal. They didn't leave messages. They knew not to. Instead, they issued a press release short, vague, but laced with panic. The board of Hayden and Vale is cooperating fully with the investigation. We have taken preliminary action to address the concerns raised and are committed to transparency moving forward. Translation: they were bracing for collapse. The news coverage intensified. By the afternoon, my name was no longer omitted. It was printed in full. Margaret Rowen, 62, former VP of Financial Strategy, has been identified as the whistleblower behind the ongoing federal inquiry. Suddenly, I was visible again, not as an employee, as a reckoning. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years began to reach out, some to applaud, some to gossip, some to ask for favors now that my name held weight again. I didn't answer any of them. Not yet, because this wasn't the time for celebration. It was the time to finish what I started. That evening, I received a letter, handwritten, couriered, signed by the company's chairman. He wanted a conversation. Said the firm was willing to discuss a reinstatement, a rebuilding of trust, and a mutually beneficial transition back into leadership. He even included a proposed salary, 7 figures. It was supposed to feel like a triumph. It felt like bait. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it flatters. Sometimes it bribes. I read the letter twice. Then I placed it into the shredder without a word. Because legacy isn't a job title. It's what remains after you've burned the contracts and walked away. The next day, I met with the Scholarship Foundation. It was something I had planned for years but never acted on. Always waiting for the right time. Always too busy managing someone else's ambitions. But now there were no more meetings to postpone it for. I named it after my husband, the Daniel Rowen Fund. It would go to women in finance, age 30 and up, who took breaks in their careers for caregiving, a grief, or survival. The women whose resumes didn't sparkle, but whose lives carried weight. When I told the board director what I wanted, she asked, "Will you be the face of it?" No, I said, "Let the work speak." That night, I sat on my porch. The sky had cleared. The kind of clarity that only comes after a storm has passed through and taken what needed to be taken. And I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Julian. Not at the company. Not even at myself for not seeing it sooner. Because the silence they tried to bury me in became the soil I rebuilt my life from. And when they tried to silence me in 3 days, I answered in 3 acts: truth, timing, and unshakable calm. The days that followed were quieter, not empty, just different. Like a room that used to echo with other people's needs, but now only held the sound of your own breath. I began waking without the old urgency, the kind that drives you to over-explain, to over-deliver, to prove your worth in decimal points in midnight emails. Now, my time belonged to me. I took morning walks, not for fitness at Betrayal, but for grounding. I watched the same neighborhood I'd driven past for years and noticed how little I'd truly seen of it, how many doorsteps I'd ignored, how many windows I'd passed without a glance. People smiled at me differently now, some with recognition, some with hesitation, but I returned each look with the same expression: peace, because I had nothing to defend. The media still called. They wanted interviews, exclusives, a televised sit-down. I declined everyone, not because I was afraid, but because I knew the truth didn't need to be sold. It had already done its job. Meanwhile, the company unraveled in the places no headline could fully capture. There were quiet departures, HR staff resigning to pursue new opportunities, compliance officers furloughed, and finally Julian. It wasn't announced. I found out through a journalist's tweet. Sources confirm Julian Eastwood has stepped down amid investigation fallout. No statement, no goodbye, just silence. The same silence he once handed to me in a boardroom like a final sentence. Poetic, really. But the most unexpected message came 2 weeks later. A plain envelope, no return address, slid under my door while I was out. Inside was a short note, typed, unsigned. They all thought I was weak. Thank you for showing them otherwise. No name, no clues. Just the knowledge that somewhere inside that collapsing machine, someone had been watching, waiting, learning. It reminded me that truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it seeds change in the cracks of systems that deserve to fall. I kept the note in a drawer not as a trophy, but as a reminder that not all revolutions begin with shouting. Some begin with one woman, sitting in a quiet house, refusing to vanish. Later that month, I received an invitation to speak at a leadership summit. All expenses paid, headliner spot. The theme: resilience in the face of corporate crisis. I declined, but I sent them the name of a single mother I mentored years ago, a woman who left the company after being pushed out of a promotion, who went on to build her own firm. She called me the day after the event. Her voice shook with gratitude. She said, "I told them the truth about what happened to you. They listened. I smiled, not because they listened, but because she finally spoke. This is how change begins, not in conference halls, but in the ripple of quiet courage passed from one woman to the next. The scholarship launched the following spring. We awarded 5 grants that year. Each recipient sent a letter. Some included pictures of their kids. Some wrote about the nights they almost gave up. Some said the money changed their lives. But the one that stayed with me simply said, "This made me feel seen." That's what this was always about. Not revenge, not recognition, just being seen. For too long, women like me were trained to disappear, to make ourselves smaller than the rooms we entered, to carry the weight of competence without ever calling it power. But silence doesn't have to be surrender. It can be strategy. It can be survival. It can be the blade you keep hidden until it matters most. One afternoon, while organizing old papers, I came across a photo. It was from my 10th work anniversary, a banquet. Everyone in suits, smiling for the camera, glasses raised in empty celebration. I was in the center smiling, too, but my eyes looked tired, like they already knew. I slipped the photo into an envelope and mailed it to the firm's new interim CEO. No note, no return address, just a reminder that I was there, that I remember, and that some ghosts don't haunt, they witness. It was a Sunday morning, one of those crisp early spring days when the air still carries the memory of winter. I was trimming the hydrangeas out front when a voice behind me said, softly, "Excuse me, Ms. Rowen." I turned. A young woman stood at the edge of my driveway, tentative but composed, mid-20s at most. She wore a navy blazer too large for her frame, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "I'm with the Department of Labor," she said quickly, almost apologetically. "I'm not here for an interview. I wanted to thank you." I said nothing, just nodded once, and she took that as permission to go on. She told me she was part of the audit team assigned to Hayden and Vale, said it was her first real case out of training, that the paperwork I submitted was so meticulously organized. It set the standard for their office now. "You made it easier for us to do the right thing," she said. I didn't want that to go unsaid. She handed me a folded document, her own copy of the internal commendation my case had received. "They don't normally share these with civilians," she added, a little embarrassed. "But I thought maybe you'd like to know. What you did mattered." I didn't read it in front of her. I thanked her, accepted it with a quiet grace, and watched her walk back to the nondescript sedan parked at the corner. Only after she left did I allow myself the smallest smile. Not because I needed the recognition, but because in a world built on erasure, validation sometimes arrives like a whisper instead of a headline. That evening, my daughter visited. She brought her kids, chaos in sneakers, laughter loud and echoing through my quiet rooms. She made dinner while I helped the boys with their homework. Ordinary things, honest things, the kind of moments that used to slip through my fingers, like sand, when every hour was spent proving myself to men who never saw me as more than a function. After we ate, she sat beside me on the porch while the boys wrestled over a soccer ball in the yard. She reached over and took my hand. I read the article again. She said, "The one where they called you a quiet force." I looked at her. She was searching for something. Maybe permission to say what had been sitting between us for weeks. "You were always strong," she said, finally. "But I didn't realize how much of it you had to carry alone." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because she finally understood. There's a unique kind of grief that comes with being believed too late. But there's also healing in it. In watching your daughter, your son, your students finally grasp the architecture of your silence. We sat there until the sun dipped low. When they left, My youngest grandson hugged me and whispered, "Grandma, I'm gonna make a company one day." I laughed. "Oh, are you?" "Yeah, and I won't fire people like they fired you." I kissed his forehead. "Make something better," I said, "something honest." That night, I pulled out an old journal, not the one filled with work notes or timelines, just blank pages. I hadn't touched it since Daniel died. I wrote one sentence. "Justice is not loud, it's deliberate." Then I closed the book. Not because the story was finished, but because the telling was. From that point forward, I said less and did more. Volunteered quietly, mentored selectively, built bridges where I used to tread water. The company eventually rebranded. New logo, new leadership, a press tour highlighting their commitment to ethical reinvention. They never publicly mentioned me again. Not once. But every woman who received a scholarship knew my name. Every auditor who reviewed the case knew the trail led back to my kitchen table. Every silence that used to feel like defeat now felt like strategy. Because in the end, they had 3 days to erase me, and I gave them a legacy instead. It wasn't until the following winter that I saw Julian again. I had just come out of the florist poinsettias in hand, red and full like the ones Daniel used to bring home every December. The wind carried the scent of cinnamon and cold steel. I turned the corner, and there he was, standing beneath the overhang of the bank across the street, coat collar high, eyes hollowed by something deeper than weather. He didn't see me at first. He was staring at the street like he expected it to swallow him. I could have walked away, slipped past, but something in me wanted to see how he'd look when our eyes met without power, without pretense, without the polished mask of corporate immunity. He looked up and stopped breathing for a second. He didn't try to smile, didn't wave, just stared, his mouth tightening like he'd rehearsed words he now knew he didn't deserve to say. I nodded once. No anger. No forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Then I walked past him. He didn't follow. That night, I told no one. Not my daughter, not my friends. Some encounters don't need witnesses. They serve as quiet punctuation marks at the end of sentences you never need to write. By spring, the investigations had concluded. The firm settled with the government. No admission of guilt. Of course, just language couched in legalese. Regret over oversights, committed to forward-looking integrity. They paid millions, reorganized, shrunk. Julian wasn't named, but he disappeared from the industry. No board seats, no lectures, just silence, the kind that outlives scandal and turns into a kind of exile. Meanwhile, the women I mentored were blooming. One started her own consultancy. Another took over finance at a mid-tier firm and rewrote their internal hiring policy. A third wrote me a letter that said, simply, "Your silence taught me to listen to my own voice." And me, I spent my mornings at the market, my afternoons walking by the lake, my evenings reading old novels I'd once abandoned for quarterly reports. I didn't need to rebuild a career. I rebuilt a life, one rooted in truth, in pace, in the knowledge that survival is not the same as silence, and that peace is not the absence of noise, but the presence of clarity. Sometimes I get invitations, panels, honors, awards named after people who would have never shared a table with me 10 years ago. I decline most of them, not out of bitterness, but because I no longer need a stage to prove I existed. I exist in the woman who finally spoke up in her exit interview, in the analyst who forwarded the suspicious email, in the intern who asked why the budget didn't add up, in the systems now too scared to stay broken because someone somewhere, is always watching. Truth is not a moment, it's a pattern. And I became the thread they couldn't pull without unraveling everything. There's a box in my study now. Not the old one, a new one. It's filled with letters, thank yous, clippings, memories of a quiet storm. I keep it not for myself, but for my granddaughter. One day, she'll ask what I did, why people still mention my name in places she never saw me work, and I'll tell her the truth, not with grandeur, not with drama, but with the same calm I used the day they tried to erase me, the day they gave me 3 days to vanish, and I answered with silence, sharp enough to echo for years, because some voices aren't loud, they're permanent. There's a ritual I keep now, every year. On the same Friday they let me go, I drive to the old headquarters, not to haunt it, to witness. The building's changed hands, new name on the glass, new logo that tries too hard to feel modern. The lobby's been remodeled, the marble replaced with minimalist tile, and the reception desk now staffed by a rotating cast of polite 20-somethings with identical smiles. But the bones of it are the same. The elevator still breathes the same cold air. The parking garage still smells faintly of steel and rain. I never go inside. I sit across the street with a coffee and a pen, sometimes scribbling notes on the back of napkins. Not plans, not regrets, just thoughts. Reminders to myself of what was taken and what I took back. Last year, I saw a group of young employees step out laughing, dressed in smart casual uniforms of ambition. One of them paused, looked at the building, and said something I couldn't hear, but her expression told me everything. She hadn't yet been broken by it. I hope she never is. I hope the cracks we left behind made space for better roots. Later that day, I visited Daniel's grave. I brought him chrysanthemums, yellow, bold, the kind that don't bend in the wind. I sat beside the stone and told him everything about the collapse, the settlement, the scholarship, our daughter, the boys, the letter from the Department of Labor, the look on Julian's face. And then I said, "You were right, they took everything they could, until I drew the line. The breeze picked up, and I swear I could feel him smile. I used to think grief was a pit, something to fall into, something to climb out of. But it's not. Grief is a second skin. You wear it. Learn to live inside it. You don't escape it. You grow around it. The same way I grew around the silence, around the dismissal, around the erasure. And in doing so, I became something sharper. Not harder, just more precise. They thought they could write the final chapter for me. But I wrote the afterword, and now I am quiet, but never invisible. I host Sunday dinners. My daughter cooks. The boys bring chaos and laughter. Sometimes, when they're not looking, I watch the three of them together and feel something like peace. Not because things are perfect, but because I know what it costs to get here. One evening, my daughter pulled me aside. She said, They still talk about you in the finance circles." "Right," I raised an eyebrow. "They call you the Echo, the one that ended a legacy with a whisper?" I didn't laugh. I just nodded, because that's exactly what I became. An echo. A cold wind that slips through cracks they thought were sealed. A silence they can't outpace. A story they can't scrub clean. And when I leave this world, I don't want applause. I don't need statues. I want someone to say, "She didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She just waited. And when the time was right, she spoke in a language they couldn't unhear. Because strength isn't always volume. Sometimes Strength is the woman who stays seated, hands folded, as the building shakes around her, knowing she's already laid the charges beneath their feet. They gave me 3 days to disappear. I gave them a legacy carved in silence. And I walked away, not as their victim, but as their mirror. Years from now, I know they'll try to rewrite it. There will be interns who stumble on my name buried in an old audit report, middle managers who retell the story over drinks, trimming facts to protect legacies, a new generation of executives who will inherit the company's rebirth and call it progress, without ever knowing the blood it took to cleanse it. But some truths don't need to be remembered to endure. They live in policy changes, in the fine print, in the nervous glances shared when someone suggests cutting corners. They live in whispers passed between assistants, in questions that never used to be asked, in the tightening of jaws when ethics come up in meetings. I've become part of the structure now, not as a ghost, as a boundary, the kind that doesn't speak until it must, but when it does, shifts the weight of the room. There are days when I still feel the echoes, mornings when I wake and instinctively reach for my work phone that no longer exists. Moments when the scent of printer ink or the click of heels down a marble hallway triggers a reflex I no longer need. But then I remind myself, I don't belong to that world anymore. I outgrew it the day they tried to bury me under it. Not because I had something to prove, but because they assumed I never would. That was always their mistake. They thought my silence was submission. They didn't understand that silence was my strategy. That while they plotted how to push me out, I was cataloging every crack in their foundation. That every moment they underestimated me was another entry in the ledger I kept, one only I could read. And when the time came, I didn't rage. I didn't scream. I opened the book and let them hang themselves on the facts. There's a quote I once read, tucked at the bottom of an op-ed in a journal no longer in print. It said, "Justice does not arrive on schedule. It arrives when it is earned." At the time, I underlined it in pencil. Now I carry it in my spine. Because the truth is, no one can take what you've built if you build it beneath their notice. And once it's ready, you don't have to ask permission to use it. You just pull the pin. I don't hate them. Hate is a heavy thing to carry. And I've laid down everything that doesn't serve me. All that's left is clarity, a life with room for softness again, for porch lights and long walks, for the hum of grandkids in the hallway, for the smell of cinnamon bread cooling on a Sunday, for mornings spent not racing the clock, but savoring the sound of it ticking gently, without urgency. I write, sometimes, essays, letters, fragments of memory captured not for the public, but for the women who will come after me. Women who may never know my name, but will feel its echo when they stand their ground. To them, I say this, let them call you difficult. Let them call you cold. Let them underestimate your silence. And then, when the moment is right, let them hear the sound of everything you never had to say. Because in a world that tried to erase me in 3 days, I did more than survive. I became the reason they won't try that again. Thank you all for listening to my story until the very end. I hope that, even just a little, what I've shared can bring something meaningful to you. Goodbye, and see you again.